The woman known to history as Margaret Beaufort was born on the 31st of May either in 1441 or in 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, Bedfordshire. Her father was John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who was the grandson of John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III, a genealogical connection that Margaret was to exploit in order to legitimize her son Henry's claim to the throne during the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's mother was Margaret Beauchamp, the daughter of Sir John Beauchamp of Bletsoe and the heiress to her family's fortune after her only brother, John Beauchamp, died childless and unmarried in 1421, making her an attractive and wealthy match for her first husband, Oliver St. John, whose death in 1438 made her available for John Beaufort to marry. Margaret's pursuit of royal power was somewhat hindered by a series of scandals that had enveloped her family generations earlier. The first of these concerned her own father, who, after being imprisoned by the French following his capture at the Battle of Bosworth in 1421 in Henry V's wars against the French king, paid a staggering £24,000 ransom, equivalent to £15 million today, to secure his release over 17 years later in 1438. However, although he was impoverished by the extortionate price he had to pay for his release, he did benefit financially when he married Margaret from the vast estates that she held around Bedfordshire, Wiltshire and Dorset. Although Margaret was the sole product of her mother's marriage to John Beaufort, Margaret Beauchamp was much more fruitful in her previous marriage, and so her daughter had many half-sisters and half-brothers, namely John, Oliver, Edith, Mary, Margaret and Elizabeth St. John, a side of the family that Margaret Beaufort remained close with throughout her life. After marrying his wife Margaret in 1442, John Beaufort returned to the battlefield as a commander of an English regiment that was to fight against King Charles VII of France after his invasion of Gascony in 1443, presenting him with a perfect opportunity to reignite his military career. After being anointed Captain General of Aquitaine and Normandy and bestowed with the title of Duke of Somerset by an Act of Parliament, John Beaufort set out to prove himself to his contemporaries, but his campaign to France went disastrously wrong, and he was exposed as a poor and cowardly leader, who, although able to take some minor French towns, never had the courage to directly engage the French army, being further lambasted for allowing his men to pillage and plunder at will, and also for his misappropriation of royal funds, which he used to enrich himself. Returning to England after his disappointing tour of duty, Henry VI was so infuriated with his conduct that he refused to see him, and John Beaufort was left with no other option but to retire to his country estate in Dorset, where, eaten away with unbearable shame, he decided to take his own life on the 27th of May, 1444. His young daughter was barely a year old at the time. The humiliating conduct and death of Margaret's father was compounded by another, even more serious family transgression that happened even earlier, as the Beauforts' link to royalty was always somewhat tainted due to the fact that they originated from an initially illegitimate offshoot following John of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford, the governess to his children from his first marriage to Blanche of Lancaster. Following the death of John's wife Constance in 1394, the woman he had been unfaithful to, his relationship to Catherine was legitimized after they married in January 1396, which meant that all his future offspring would be officially recognized as having royal blood. Yet, despite this, the fact that some of their children had been born out of wedlock meant that the scandal surrounding John of Gaunt lived on throughout the years, persisting all the way up to his great-great-grandson, King Henry VII, where it was used as a tool to invalidate his reign. Margaret herself was a woman of remarkable devotion, kindness, and generosity, and later in her life used her almost inexhaustible funds to donate heavily to the Church, an institution she had the utmost respect for and that represented the Christian religion that would serve as a guiding light for her in some of her darkest hours, especially regarding the safety of her son, as Margaret was a dedicated family woman who found purpose in her life safeguarding the Tudor bloodline, a desire that was emulated by the care and attention she always showed towards her beloved Henry, her only child, a primal protective instinct she also extended to her dearly loved grandchildren, who she adoringly showered with gifts. The seriousness in which Margaret approached the survival of her bloodline could often spill over into her mischievous sense of humour, where all niceties would be set aside for those who had dared challenge her family, such as the rather overweight Duchess of Burgundy and her equally rotund entourage, who had supported a pretender to the throne and were, to Margaret, in a letter to the Queen's Chamberlain in April 1496, great ladies all, and according to their great estates, they have great personages. Yet Margaret, although strong-willed in everything she set her heart on, was never needlessly cruel to her enemies, something that Henry took great pains to implement in his own reign. In addition, Margaret, who was renowned for her love of cards and was even known to place bets on chess, equally relished playing the game of real estate, and during her early years, when her property was constantly threatened by her Yorkist rivals, made every effort to maneuver herself into a stronger position either through political intrigue or marriage, for one of her main aims was to retain her inheritance for the sake of her son Henry, and it was with this singular dedication to her son's welfare that she would eventually harbour the greatest ambition of them all, for her son to become King of England. At the time of Margaret Beaufort's birth in 1443, the Kingdom of England was ruled by the House of Lancaster, an offshoot of the House of Plantagenet, which had governed England and its overseas possessions since 1154, and its weak-willed King Henry VI, who led efforts to resist the annexation of English lands in northern France by French Emperor Charles VII and his Burgundian allies in the closing stages of the 100 Years' War. This was a conflict that would not only lead to the dishonour of John Beaufort, but to the eventual loss of England's entire realm abroad during Margaret's lifetime, and to the rise of another branch of the Plantagenets, the House of York, as serious contenders for the English throne. Following the death of Margaret's father, and in conjunction with the fact that she was of royal descent and no longer had a male protector, many noble houses in the realm became very interested in securing her wardship, a type of guardianship in which the selected family would be able to determine the fate of the infant heir's property, as Margaret, being the eldest child of John Beaufort, had, in combination with her mother's impressive portfolio, also inherited all of the vast lands her father held in Kent, Worcestershire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Somerset, Essex, and Sussex, making her an extremely wealthy individual at a very young age. Beaufort's untimely passing, and the fact that Margaret was technically part of the royal family, sprung King Henry VI into action, who entrusted her wardship to William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk and steward of the king's household, who secured her betrothal to his own son, John de la Pole, in 1450, which was to be carried out when she was 12 and had come of age. However, Despite being in the legal custody of the de la Poles, Margaret never left her ancestral home at Bletsoe Castle, where she would have shared her childhood with the numerous offspring of her mother's first marriage to Oliver St. John, including her half-brothers John and Oliver, and half-sisters Edith, Mary and Margaret. At Bletsoe, Margaret enjoyed a privileged upbringing befitting of a noble woman of her stature, and here she would be taught to properly manage and administrate hereditary estates, would listen to the finest musicians hired to entertain her aristocratic clan, and where she, alongside her half-sister Margaret St. John, who would later become Abbess of Shaftesbury, would first be inducted into the Christian faith. She was taught about the importance of religion by her own devout mother, who would also instill in the young Margaret a voracious appetite to read, illustrated by her mother's will, in which she bequeathed to her many books, all of which were doubtlessly added to the impressive library Margaret fervently maintained as an adult. Nevertheless, after Margaret's betrothal to John de la Pole in 1450, Margaret would find herself, at 6 years old, at the centre of a scandal that rocked England, as her guardian, the unpopular William de la Pole, was blamed for encouraging Henry VI to follow a policy of peace and cooperation with the King of France, which had resulted in the loss of a significant number of English possessions on the continent and the retention of just Calais and Aquitaine by the end of August 1450. Charges which were made a lot worse by the further accusation that de la Pole was planning to take advantage of Margaret's royal stock to advance his own family's claim to the throne by marrying her to his son. Even after William de la Pole was killed by his enemies after being intercepted in the North Sea on his way to exile in France, Margaret remained promised to his son, while King Henry VI, who had been humiliated by his loss of territory in France, found his ascendancy challenged by Richard, Duke of York, who in February 1452 marched on London. But although nothing came of it and he was eventually pardoned, tension continued to rise between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Henry was keen to consolidate his own support by awarding honours to those who had stuck by him in the face of the Duke of York's open hostility, including his half-brother Edmund Tudor, and so, in February 1453, a nearly 10-years-old Margaret was summoned to Henry's court in London, where her marriage contract with John de la Pole was nullified, and where she was re-promised instead to Edmund Tudor, who alongside his brother Jasper Tudor became her new wards on the 24th of March, a personal triumph for the brothers who were made rich beyond their wildest dreams, for they would now share Margaret's enormous inheritance between them. Now betrothed to a man who was a close confidant of the king, Margaret eagerly threw herself into court life, attending one of her first royal functions on the 23rd of April 1453 at Windsor Castle for the Garter celebrations, where she appeared alongside Henry's glamorous Queen Margaret, bedecked in an exquisite red dress, a fashion statement that would no doubt have inspired the young and impressionable Margaret to follow suit after King Henry gifted her 100 marks for clothes on the 12th of May for her upcoming first meeting with her future husband, Edmund Tudor, the man who would tie her permanently to the Lancastrian cause, and with the death of Margaret's uncle Somerset, one of Henry VI's most trusted advisers a few days later on the 22nd of May 1455 at the Battle of St. Albans, following the Duke of York's resumption of hostilities, marking the start of the Wars of the Roses, he was to remain her only male protector. Just 12 days after St. Albans, on the 31st of March 1455, Margaret married Edmund Tudor, who was 10 years her senior. In the process, elevating herself significantly up the Lancastrian ladder and taking the title Countess of Richmond, which she retained for the rest of her life. She settled with her new husband at Llanthay in Pembrokeshire, Wales, where Edmund was tasked with maintaining law and order and curbing the authority of the rebellious Welsh magnate and Yorkish supporter Griffith ap Nicholas, who at the time had control of the most important administrative centre in the region, Carmarthen Castle. This was a period of Margaret's life that was to be marked by uncertainty and anxiety. The first fray occurred when Edmund successfully seized the castle at Carmarthen, compelling the Yorkists to reply by sending a force under the command of Sir William Herbert and Sir Walter Devereux, whose 2,000-strong regiment proved too strong for Edmund, and whose brief imprisonment on the 10th of August 1455 caused Margaret great despair, as the couple had successfully consummated the marriage, and she was deeply afraid for the safety of her unborn child. Although Edmund was released, to the great relief of his teenage bride, an even more tragic twist of fate was to happen when Margaret was just 6 months pregnant, her marriage abruptly ending following Edmund's death from the plague on the 1st of November 1456, a disease that Margaret, now alone and vulnerable in hostile territory, was so terrified would also kill her and the baby growing inside her, that she requested every medical treatise on the illness that she could find, in an obsession to keep it at bay. Desperate for a protector, Jasper Tudor, fully aware of the danger his sister-in-law was in, dropped everything to come to her rescue, and a now heavily pregnant Margaret bid farewell to her marital home in mid-November, accompanying Jasper through cold winter winds to arrive at Pembroke Castle, where, on the 28th of January 1457, after a brutal and exhausting labour, she gave birth to Henry, and thus began an unbreakable bond between mother and son, one that was to overcome the greatest of trials and tribulations, but was to be equally bolstered by glorious triumphs. And although Margaret had survived the ordeal of childbirth, it is likely that the internal damage she suffered that day meant she could never have children again, for Henry remained her one and only child. Margaret now underwent the traditional ritual known as churching, whereby the mother was to spend 5 weeks with her newborn away from men, and after finishing this period with a ceremony of purification that allowed her to re-enter society, it was Jasper who would lead the search for Margaret's next husband, which commenced in March 1457 with a journey from Newport to Gwent. At the time, being a young, unmarried heiress of extraordinary wealth, Margaret was considered a very eligible match, and with Jasper ever eager to strengthen the House of Lancaster, he decided it was best to give her hand in marriage to one of his loyal supporters, settling on the son of Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford. However, during marriage negotiations, which did not require the women to be present, Margaret, empowered by a powerful impetus to safeguard her young son's interests, showed a remarkable degree of involvement despite being just 13 years old, opting to accompany Jasper to Buckingham's estate at Greenfield in Newport, a journey of more than 100 miles, that, even though this was only 2 months after she had given birth, she was willing to make. Despite Henry Stafford's mother being the granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, making him closely related to Margaret, a dispensation was granted by the Pope on the 6th of April 1457, and after Margaret had completed the customary year of mourning for her deceased husband, the couple married on the 3rd of January 1458, marking the start of a relationship quite at odds with the loveless political unions of the time, for it seemed Margaret and Stafford developed genuine feelings for each other, illustrated by the fact that they regularly celebrated their marriage anniversary every year thereafter with sumptuous feasts. On the other hand, only 5 days later, on the 8th of January, the joy of Margaret's wedding would be contrasted with the news that her son Henry was to become the joint ward of Jasper Tudor and the King's treasurer, the Earl of Shrewsbury, although Henry would stay the majority of the time with Jasper at his castle at Pembroke, where the young prince could be assured of his safety and where Jasper filled the void left by the death of the youth's father, developing his own unbreakable bond with his nephew, who he treated like his own son. With Margaret assured that Henry was being lovingly cared for by his uncle, Margaret settled back into a life of aristocratic splendour with Henry Stafford at his residence in Bourne, and although the union produced no children, she would live happily alongside her new spouse, but her thoughts would always turn back to her son Henry, who she now saw infrequently, and who, as a child, was often sickly, his frail health worrying Margaret immensely and heightened by the sorrow of their separation. Nevertheless, as Margaret fretted about the health of her infant son while tirelessly proving herself as a devoted wife, political developments remained ominous. And despite King Henry VI's effort to mend the deepening divide of the Yorkist and Lancastrian folds at a ceremony known as Love Day on the 24th of March 1457, in which the Duke of York symbolically followed in the steps of Henry and his Queen for the realm to see, tensions continued to rise, culminating in a major Lancastrian defeat at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July 1460, resulting in the capture of King Henry VI by the Duke of York, who forced Henry to name him heir to the throne, and also the death of Margaret's father-in-law and head of her husband's house, the Duke of Buckingham. Consequently, Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, and on the 30th of December 1460, after being provided with an army by Mary of Gueldres, and with a group of vengeful English nobles at her back, achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Wakefield, resulting in the deaths of the Duke of York and his 17-year-old son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. Yet Margaret and her family's jubilation was to be short-lived, coming to a sudden end after York's eldest surviving son Edward defeated Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March 1461, and with Henry VI and his Queen taking flight to France, the resurgent Yorkist rebel crowned himself Edward IV, a moment of utter devastation for Margaret, for now she believed her very life and the life of her beloved Lancastrian son were in the gravest danger they had ever faced. However, luckily for Margaret, it quickly became clear that Edward was not out for blood, and in an attempt to patch the realm up, the king was exceedingly forgiving of his enemies, on the 25th of June 1461 issuing a pardon to the family of Henry Stafford and to his younger brother John, who had fought against Edward at Towton, an act of clemency perhaps made a lot easier given that Henry Stafford was the cousin of the new king, as their mothers were both sisters. On the other hand, despite Margaret's inheritance and titles being relatively unaffected by the Yorkist changeover, Jasper Tudor was branded a traitor, and as a result, the wardship of Henry, now 5 years old, was entrusted instead to one of his own henchmen, William Herbert, the same man who had captured his father Edmund at Carmarthen, who, to help further his cause, paid the king £1,000, around £643,000 in today's money, for the honour of being Henry's guardian, resulting in Henry moving across Wales from Pembroke to his new home at Raglan Castle. Like before, Margaret would endeavour to maintain as much contact as possible by frequently sending her son letters, who, for the first time, would be able to mix with other children of noble stock at Raglan, as William Herbert, and in particular his wife Anne Devereux, took a serious interest in the well-being of their young charge, providing him with great comfort and support, something the young Henry would never forget even as king, when he later welcomed Anne Devereux to his court with open arms. Yet, even though Henry was treated gracefully by Edward, to Margaret's anger this did not stop the new king from disinheriting many of his lands and giving them to his brother George, Duke of Clarence. And although Henry had been stripped of his title, his mother would still refer to him as Lord Richmond, ever hopeful she could return to him his birthright. For now, the best course of action was to reconcile with the House of York, and, alongside her husband Henry Stafford, proved herself a skillful political manoeuvrer throughout the 1460s, able to work her way into the good graces of Edward's regime at the same time as disassociating herself with the traitorous actions of some of her family members, such as the Duke of Somerset, who, in 1463, deserted Henry VI for the Yorkists, but after gaining great favour from Edward, betrayed him by switching his allegiance back to Lancaster, and was captured and executed on the battlefield on the 15th of May 1464, after being defeated by Edward's armies at the Battle of Hexham. In addition, with the later capture of King Henry VI in Lancashire in July 1465, and his subsequent imprisonment in the Tower of London for 5 years, it was more crucial than ever for Margaret to gain the favour of Edward, which, by December 1466, after Edward granted her the previously confiscated Beaufort Manor at Woking, which had belonged to her disgraced father, she had seemingly won, and for the next few years with Stafford she would live a carefree existence in the Surrey countryside, visiting the local church of St. Peter, going on day trips to local towns such as Guildford for household supplies, and where she even tried her hand at hunting and hawking. Despite her idyllic living situation and her increasing closeness with Stafford's family, whose mother and brother John became close companions, as well as her many trips to another of her childhood homes, Maxey Castle, to see her own mother Margaret Beaufort, such as at Christmas 1466, when, alongside her half-sister Elizabeth St. John, she spent 6 weeks there, Margaret was always concerned about Henry, and in September 1467 she would make the journey to Raglan Castle to visit him for a week, perhaps for the first time in many years, for it was the first recorded visit in Stafford's accounts, and it was likely that the trip was far too short for Margaret and tinged with jealousy for William Herbert and his wife, a couple who Margaret had no strong affinity for, but who had been given the privilege of raising her son, something that Margaret doubtlessly longed to do herself. Nevertheless, to realise her dream of getting her son back, Margaret would again have to play politics, and in December 1468 she made enormous preparations to receive the king himself, buying for herself a luxurious red dress for the occasion and sparing no expense as she splashed out on an enormous 5-course meal, complete with an assortment of the finest seafood, an exuberant purple hunting tent, and the most talented musicians in the land, in a visit aimed at determining her loyalty to the Yorkist regime, as a rift between Edward and one of his most important allies, the Earl of Warwick, was steadily growing, with many appalled at Edward's choice of Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of low noble stock who Edward had married, quite controversially, for love. Yet Margaret's fealty to Edward, however necessary, would once again land her son in great peril, for her son Henry, accompanying his guardian William Herbert, became involved in the ensuing conflict between the king and the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Edgecote on the 24th of July 1469, a crushing defeat for the Yorkist faction that led to the capture and execution of William Herbert, and when news of the outcome came to Margaret, she feared for her son's life, spending an inordinate amount of money to find out if he had been struck down like his guardian. But, to her relief, Henry had indeed survived, and had been whisked far away to Webley Castle in the care of Anne Devereux, and with Henry VI seemingly in the ascendancy, and William Herbert deceased, Margaret pounced on the opportunity to reclaim custody of her son and his birthright in a visit to London on the 24th of August, but to no avail. When the realm was resettled on the 3rd of October 1470 and Henry VI was reinstated, Margaret's luck turned for the better when she was finally given the opportunity to meet Henry again, this time in the company of the king himself, keen to meet the progeny of his greatly missed half-brother Edmund, who granted them an audience at Westminster on the 27th of October. And although it was decided that Henry was to resume being Jasper's ward, it was also proclaimed that Henry should spend some quality time with his mother beforehand. Margaret was elated, and in the next month, November, she would spend 2 weeks with her teenage son, who accompanied them to Woking, where she entertained him with a tour of the Surrey countryside, and where most likely the bond between mother and son was reinforced even further. But before long, Margaret would be heartbroken again as Henry left her company to join Jasper on the 11th of November, a grief that would be intensified, for unbeknownst to both, the next time they would meet would be 15 years later, as Edward IV bounced violently back onto the scene. On the 11th of April 1471, Edward, who was popular in the capital, marched on London to great fanfare, declaring himself king and imprisoning Henry in the Tower of London. And on the 4th of May he went on to defeat a rescue force sent by Henry's wife Queen Margaret at the Battle of Tewkesbury, brutally slaughtering the young heir to the throne, Edward of Westminster, before banishing Queen Margaret back to France and murdering King Henry VI on the 21st of May, an unexpected turn of events that had profound consequences on the standing of the young Henry Tudor. Margaret did not openly grieve the deaths of her Lancastrian kinsmen, for now, with the extinction of the Beaufort male bloodline, the crown was passed onto the female line, of which Margaret was the oldest and, by extension, her son Henry. At her urging, Henry and Jasper fled the country in October, and after entering the North Sea, strong winds diverted their path to Brittany, where they were received graciously by Duke Francis II as noble captives. But Margaret's misfortunes were not at an end, as on the 2nd of October 1471, her husband Henry Stafford, who had been injured fighting for Edward's cause at the Battle of Barnet, succumbed to his injuries, and in a testament to the love and respect he had for his wife's abilities, he named her the principal executor of his will, and most of his earthly possessions he bequeathed to my beloved wife Margaret, Countess of Richmond. In the meantime, being the mother of a potential rival to Edward IV, Margaret found herself in an incredibly precarious position, and in order to improve her standing, she opted for a pragmatic marriage with pro-Yorkist Thomas Stanley, the steward of the king's household, and while Margaret benefited from the closer proximity to the Yorkist fold, Stanley profited from the sizable inheritance his marriage to her entailed, a union of convenience cemented by a wedding ceremony that took place on the 12th of June 1472. But despite Margaret's essential political shift, she was also looking out for her son, placing some of her own ancestral lands in Devon and Somerset in a trust on the 2nd of June 1472 for Henry to claim in the event that he returned. Margaret, however, was not content with living life on the sidelines, and with her powerful new husband, an influential landowner with possessions in Cheshire, Lancashire and northern Wales, where he exercised considerable local heft, began making her mark on high society and allaying Edward's suspicions about her, accompanying Stanley to his manors in Latham and Knowsley, settling land disputes in Liverpool in 1473 and 1474, where, in one particular case, she acted as one of the main judges, all the while becoming an influential presence at the royal court, where, in 1476, she accompanied the Queen and her daughters for the reburial ceremony at Fotheringhay of Richard, Duke of York. Despite her newfound popularity at the Yorkist court, Margaret maintained secret communications with her vagabond son, urging him not to return to England and to regard Edward's pledges with suspicion, for the Yorkist king was trying to lure Henry back to England with promises of wealth, titles, and even marriage to his own daughter, which were no doubt insincere and would only lead to the young prince's death. It was clear that Henry deeply respected his mother's counsel, for in November 1476, after Francis II agreed to return Henry to Edward on the condition he was treated respectfully, Henry, faking illness, managed to escape the clutches of the English envoys sent to apprehend him by taking refuge in a church. And after Henry's pursuers were driven off by townsfolk offended that they would breach the sanctuary of God, Francis was then persuaded to rescind his offer. Yet, despite her son's close call, Margaret continued to bend the knee to Edward, and by 1480, after being entrusted with carrying Edward's youngest daughter Bridget to the font where she was to be christened, it was clear that Margaret had improved her position considerably, and as she rose through the Yorkist ranks, she started to entertain the possibility that she could negotiate Henry's safe return. By June 1482, after the death of her beloved mother Margaret, she finally produced some tangible results, agreeing with Edward that Henry was to be permitted to receive a portion of his grandmother's inheritance, an arrangement marked by the king's stamp on a document dated the 3rd of June 1482, in which it was proclaimed that if Henry were to return, that he would be in the grace and favour of the King's Highness. But with the stage set for Henry's return, Margaret's dreams would be crushed again with the unexpected death of Edward on the 9th of April, and with the agreement yet to be finalised, Henry's fate became uncertain once more. The English crown was now usurped by Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who, like many, had always despised the lowly origins of Edward's queen Elizabeth Woodville, who now fought to prevent Richard from involving himself in the affairs of government and to make sure that the kingship smoothly transitioned to her son, Edward V. Yet her plans soon disintegrated after Richard, in combination with the Duke of Buckingham, the grandson of Margaret's ex-father-in-law, who had his own gripe with Elizabeth since he had been forced against his will to marry her low-born sister, intercepted the 12-year-old Edward V at Northampton, and while the Queen and the rest of her children took refuge at Westminster Abbey, Edward and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were instead sent to the Tower of London, where their claim was deemed illegitimate by Richard, who crowned himself king on the 6th of July 1482. With Margaret's husband briefly arrested, and Richard illustrating he would stop at nothing to eliminate all those who opposed him after the brutal beheading of Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's most trusted counsellors, Thomas Stanley was left with no choice but to indicate his support for Richard. And although Margaret attended the coronation banquet, deep down she resented her new king for ruining the arrangement that would finally have seen Henry returned to her. Always thinking of what was best for her son, Margaret may have been involved in a failed plot to rescue the incarcerated princes from the Tower of London, as it is likely she thought that Henry would be more favourably received if Edward V, a young princeling of 12 years old, was on the throne. However, this was not to be, as although no one knows for certain, the most widely accepted version of events is that Richard, realizing that the security of his position would always be threatened by the princes, ordered them to be murdered. But whatever their fate, they were never seen again. With the disappearance of the young princes, and with the popularity of the usurper Richard III, who proclaimed his own son Edward as his heir, dwindling as a result of the widespread rumour that he had sanctioned the killings of his own nephews, Margaret's dedication to her son took on a whole new dimension, as now it was her mission to make Henry, with his pure Lancastrian blood, the King of England. Yet first, she would have to legitimize his claim, as Henry was unknown to many people, having spent a large portion of his life in exile. First, Margaret would have to arrange a marriage that would further validate his claim in the eyes of the people, and so began negotiations with the family of the deposed Queen Elizabeth, the Woodvilles, whose daughter Elizabeth of York was the perfect candidate. For since the deaths of her brothers in captivity, many in the realm believed her to be the rightful heir to the throne. With the Woodvilles being heavily guarded at Westminster Abbey by Richard's men, Margaret employed the help of her trusted Welsh physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, who, entrusted with the marriage proposal, was able to pass through to Queen Elizabeth on the pretext that he was seeing a patient, and without arousing the suspicion of the men outside, he was able to deliver Margaret's message, which Elizabeth, stricken with grief for the disappearance of her two sons and offered a chance to exact revenge on their murderer, firmly agreed to. With the conspiracy set in motion, Margaret became its architect, enlisting the support of many of Edward IV's former henchmen, including Giles Daubeny, Richard Guildford, Thomas Ramney, John Cheney, and, most significantly, the Duke of Buckingham, the man who had originally conspired with Richard to place him on the throne, but who now, regretting his involvement, especially in the light of the young prince's demise, was willing to change allegiance. And as Margaret stepped up recruitment, she informed Henry of her plan, assuring him that if he were to sail to Wales, then he would find support waiting for him there. However, by the 11th of October, King Richard had cottoned on to the conspiracy, and initially believing that the Duke of Buckingham was the mastermind, he had him immediately outlawed as the Duke rose up in Wales on the 18th of October as planned. Yet heavy rain prevented them from entering England across the River Severn, and soon the Duke was on the run from royal authorities as Henry, unaware of developments, landed in England a few days later, but turned back after growing suspicious of the claims that the Duke's uprising had been a success. The whole enterprise was a disaster, and, with the Woodvilles uprising in Kent, was also put down at the same time. Following the capture and decapitation of the Duke of Buckingham at Salisbury Market-place on the 2nd of November, Richard became aware of Margaret's involvement in the plot, and suddenly she was at his mercy, and her life was only spared because the king, aware that he was deeply unpopular, realized he needed the support of her husband Stanley as a counterbalance to ensure his own political survival. But despite Margaret's miraculous escape, Richard was able to dish out reprisals for her treachery in other ways, and in a devastating blow to her prestige, declared that all of her lands, which she had sought to protect and maintain throughout her life, were to be transferred to her husband, Stanley, and that for the foreseeable future she was to remain under house arrest, with her husband as her jailer. But even though Margaret was locked up, she was still able to smuggle messages, probably with the knowledge of Stanley, out to Henry, who, during her incarceration, was busy drumming up support for a second invasion at the same time as avoiding Richard's efforts to apprehend him. As, with Duke Francis's health failing him, his treasurer, Pierre Landois, proved more susceptible to Richard's bribes, compelling Henry and his uncle Jasper Tudor to flee Brittany and to disguise himself as a commoner in order to seek asylum with the King of France, Charles VIII, at the time a 13-year-old boy, whose sister and Queen Regent, Anne de Beaujeu, luckily accepted him. Richard III was not so fortunate, as his own son Edward had suddenly died on the 9th of April 1484, and with his Queen Anne unable to bear more children, rumours began to emerge that, to the alarm of Margaret, Richard was planning to marry Henry's betrothed, Elizabeth of York, whose beauty had started to become noted by the courtiers and nobles of the realm, adding a real sense of urgency as Henry organised his second attack. As Richard prepared his army and set up his headquarters in Nottingham for the coming invasion, he also took care to mount a scathing propaganda campaign against Henry, and it was here that Margaret's checkered family history came back to haunt her, as, in a bid to delegitimize his rival Richard, he made sure to point out that her great-grandfather, John of Gaunt, had committed double adultery, and that as a result, Henry's claim to the throne, predicated on an untainted connection to the royal bloodline, was invalid. With Margaret communicating with her son every step of the way, Henry, with a 3,000-strong force at his back, which he was hoping would increase once he was in Britain, set off from Harfleur on the 1st of August 1485, and on the 7th of August he disembarked at Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire on the Welsh coast, marching through Wales unopposed before setting up camp at Merivale Abbey, where, in the evening of the 21st of August, Henry was joined by his loyal followers, including John Wells, Margaret's half-brother. The next day, on the 22nd of August, both armies met at Market Bosworth, but with Richard the more experienced battle commander and possessing 3 times as many men, Margaret would doubtlessly have been worried about the outcome of the battle, for, in contrast, Henry had no battlefield experience, but as battle commenced, it was Margaret's own husband Stanley who betrayed Richard and turned the tide in Henry's favour, and Richard was struck down as his horse slipped at the edge of a bog. To great fanfare, Henry entered Leicester, and to shouts of "God save King Henry," passed the first decree of his reign, informing the public that Richard was dead and that the men who fought the battle could all return back home, while Margaret penned the auspicious news in her Book of Hours, simply writing, "This day King Henry VII won the field, where was slain King Richard III." Following Henry's triumph at the Battle of Bosworth, it is reported that upon hearing the news of her son's victory, that Margaret started sobbing uncontrollably in the belief that such a great success was bound to be followed up with a disaster. But luckily, her fears were mistaken, for instead the coronation ceremony of King Henry VII went ahead without issue on the 30th of October 1485, and it would be his faithful uncle Jasper who was bestowed the ultimate honour of carrying St. Edward's crown up the aisle of Westminster Abbey. It was the culmination of Henry's first few weeks of office, a period of time he chose not to spend in London, but instead in a clear sign of his affection with his mother at their ancestral home in Woking, where, as a teenager, he had spent a joyful 2 weeks with his mother before his exile, and a place that would always be dear to his heart. And throughout his reign, Henry would show himself eternally grateful for the tireless support of his mother, writing in a letter to her, "I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire it, and I know well that I am as much bounden to do so as any creature living for the great and singular motherly love and affection that it hath pleased you at all times to bear towards me." And indeed, convening his first Parliament on the 7th of November 1485, Henry gave everything to his mother, proclaiming her to be a femme sole, a woman who did not require her husband's consent and was solely responsible for all of her business affairs, at a stroke making Margaret one of the most powerful women in England. And as an illustration of the implicit trust he had for his mother, Margaret was lavished with further honours and responsibilities, including the wardship of the young Duke of Buckingham on the 3rd of August 1486, whose father had sadly perished in Margaret's first unsuccessful attempt to bring down Richard III. Margaret was further honoured by her son in 1477, when she was allocated all of the estates formerly belonging to Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, including Coldharbour Mansion on the Thames, which she made her principal residence alongside more estates in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire and Kendal. And at Christmas 1477, she was given robes and a circlet matching those of a queen, and as the leading female figure of the reign, whose power was greater than even that of her daughter-in-law Elizabeth of York, she also assumed the title of My Lady the King's Mother. Margaret relished her new standing, using her income to become a great patron of the arts, her first major achievement in this area occurring in 1489, when she commissioned a translation of the French romance Blanchardin and Égalatin with the help of writer, diplomat, printer and translator William Caxton. And by 1494, her reputation as a lover of literature was so renowned that Wynkyn de Worde, the editor of a reissued version of Scale of Perfection, a religious work originally written by Walter Hilton, dedicated the entire volume to her. Margaret herself was an expert translator of religious works, setting aside an enormous portion of her waking hours to the translation of the Mirror of Gold for the Sinful Soul from French, as well as the 4th book of The Imitation of Christ, published originally by Thomas à Kempis and released in 1504 and 1506, which became the standard translated edition until it was replaced by another in 1531. In addition to promoting the best literary works of her day, Margaret's personal chapel, overseen by 34 members of staff, almost equal in size to the King's Chapel, became an important centre for the innovation of polyphonic music, and the same site where Margaret practised as a committed Christian, a quality that was even recognised by the Pope in 1494, when he proclaimed her as a paragon of the Church for her ceaseless promotion of the feast of the name of Jesus. Although Margaret was a devout woman of God, she was also brutally practical, and could be particularly cutthroat in her property dealings, as was the case in 1492, when she advanced her own claim on lands situated in Wiltshire and Somerset as heiress of her great-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, whose original philanthropic intentions to use them to fund the Hospice of St. Cross in Winchester was ignored by Margaret, who, upon acquiring them, also disinherited Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick and Salisbury, in the process. On the other hand, Margaret could be equally as generous on occasion, and evidence suggests she was highly concerned with the welfare of her Lincolnshire tenants, to which she was a popular landlord, promoting and funding many developments in the area, including the building of a tidal sluice in the town of Boston and the establishment of a royal commission that worked to make the River Witham more navigable. Although Margaret always kept herself busy, she always reserved time for her grandchildren and always generously gave them many gifts. To her grandsons, Prince Edward and Henry, she bought many fine clothes and books, including a copy of Cicero's De Officiliis to Edward in 1495, and to her granddaughter, Princess Margaret, she sent precious jewellery and brooches on many occasions, also being a proud godmother to her alongside the youngest, Prince Edmund. She was also heavily involved in the marriage arrangements of her grandson, Arthur, Prince of Wales, to Catherine of Aragon, before his tragic death in 1502, requesting in 1498 that the young Spanish princess learn French to communicate and also to accustom herself to drinking wine, as the water in England was not drinkable, before she entered the royal court, and in an indication that she liked to know everything about a newcomer entering her beloved family, she even had a list of Catherine's attendants drawn up. With Arthur and Catherine of Aragon married by proxy in 1499, Margaret eagerly recorded Catherine's arrival to Plymouth in her Book of Hours on the 2nd of October 1501, and she was in attendance for their wedding on the 14th of November, preparing a great celebratory feast at Cold Harbour afterwards, intending to impress her Spanish guests, and on the 5th of July 1503 she would again play the role of gracious hostess by entertaining the entire royal family before her granddaughter Margaret went north to marry James IV of Scotland to become the Queen of the Scots. Later in her life, Margaret changed her main residency from Cold Harbour to Collyweston in Northamptonshire between 1499 to 1506, where she set up a court complete with council house and prison, and was imbued with so much authority that on some occasions she was empowered to speak on behalf of the king, illustrated by a letter she wrote to administrators in Coventry addressing the plight of a wronged citizen, and at other times she was permitted to intervene in cases usually reserved only for ecclesiastical courts, such as a lawsuit concerning John Stokesley, a churchman in line for the prestigious bishopric of London, whose accession was hampered when it was alleged he had committed a plethora of crimes, the most unusual of which involved the baptism of a cat for the purposes of finding a secret treasure, and another involving the Holy Maid of Leominster, whose fantastical claim that she only needed the bread and wine of the Eucharist to survive was quickly found to be patently false. By 1504, Margaret's annual income was over £3,000 a year, allowing her to splash out on the finest jewels and to increase the size of her household to such a degree that it rivaled even the king's. But at the same time, Margaret always took her duties very seriously and made sure that her royal status was always highlighted either through the royal insignia embellished on her surviving Book of Hours, or through her carefully styled signature of Margaret R., which she began to adopt from 1499. Her dedication to the maintenance of the Tudor regime was further seen in her desire to keep up to date with foreign relations, such as when she requested a detailed pamphlet be sent to her concerning the visit of King Philippe of Castile in 1506, or the way in which she tirelessly attempted to strengthen the Tudor position by relentlessly pursuing her family's claim to the lands of Orléans in France, which were, in her mind, wrongfully owned by King Louis XII. She felt so strongly about the matter that in 1502, despite being 52 years old, she undertook the grueling journey to Calais to lodge her grievance. It was also in this phase of her life that Margaret became a major benefactor for the University of Cambridge. A 1503 charter illustrates that she used her considerable wealth to secure funding, while also appointing men from her own household to the most important posts, such as John Fisher, who was made Chancellor of Cambridge, and who accompanied Margaret for the opening of Christ's College in 1506, a now world-famous centre of education whose development was kick-started by Margaret's purchase of the manors of Moulton and Roydon. Another of Margaret's followers, Henry Hornby, made the dean of the chapel, later went on to supervise the progress of St. John's College, built between 1505 and 1509, thanks to a sizable donation from Margaret of £1,625. At New Year 1507, 3 years after the death of her husband Stanley on the 29th of July 1504, Margaret received the news that her son Henry, now 50 years old, had become dangerously ill with quinsy, a bacterial infection of the tonsils, the seriousness of the matter becoming evident after he was unable to eat or drink for 6 days straight, causing Margaret's motherly instincts to kick in, and so determined was she to nurse him back to health that she moved to Richmond Palace to take charge of the king's household, but alongside medical supplies she also insisted that black material be delivered to her. Such was her fear that Henry would slip into death, but fortunately, by the autumn, and to Margaret's relief, Henry had fully recovered. When the king fell ill once again in 1508, and with the realization that the sickness was persistent, thoughts turned to Henry's successor, the future Henry VIII, a popular figure at court who had turned 16 years old in June 1507, and a grandson that Margaret doted on, and had that month given him his first ever saddle and harness to celebrate his first joust. But the young prince found he would have to adapt to kingly life quicker than he thought in February 1509, when Henry VII once again was struck down by pestilence, this time tuberculosis. Margaret again rushed to Richmond, and ready to stay there as long as possible arranged for all of her belongings, including even her favourite bed, to be transported. But Margaret and all who attended the dying monarch realized at once that the diagnosis was grave, as, according to one source, all that stood about him scarcely might contain them from tears and weeping. And on the 21st of April, after taking his last Mass, Henry VII died later that day, leaving Margaret absolutely heartbroken. Now it was up to Margaret, who was placed at the top of the king's executors on his will, and who was herself experiencing ailing health, to arrange a proper send-off for her son, whose body was first embalmed and then moved from the Privy Chamber to the Great Chamber of Richmond, where he lay for 3 days to the sounds of daily dirges and masses, before being transferred to the Great Hall and then the chapel for 3 days each. Finally, his coffin was carried from Richmond to St. Paul's, where, after a moving sermon and mass overseen by Bishop Fisher on the 10th of May, he was then interred in his tomb at Westminster the next day, his household staff throwing in their staves of office in the grave before leaving to celebrate Henry's life in a great feast afterwards. With her dear son laid to rest, Margaret did not let grief nor ill health get in the way of preparing the way for her grandson's accession. In the interregnum, she was recognized by all as the unofficial queen and used her authority to make sure that Henry was surrounded by the right people when he finally took office, which involved reaffirming the loyalties of the men who had served her son well, such as John Fisher, Charles Somerset, Margaret's illegitimate cousin, and Richard Fox, the Bishop of Winchester, as well as removing some corrupting influences from the royal household, such as Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, Henry's much reviled tax collectors, the latter of which Margaret had a personal grudge against after he acted unfaithfully in a previous property deal, and both of whom were arrested and then executed. When the young Henry VIII married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon on the 11th of June 1509, it was unclear whether his grandmother herself was in attendance, as she was becoming increasingly frail, something that Margaret herself was very aware of, and after turning 66 years old in May, one chronicler noted how she feared that if she was to live longer, her body daily should have waxen more unwieldy, her sight should have been darked, and her hearing should have dulled more and more. Her legs should have failed her by and by, and all the other parts of her body waxed more creased every day, which things should have been matter to her of great discomfort. Despite despairing of her own physical condition, Margaret was able to hold on just long enough to attend the joint coronation of Henry and his new bride Catherine on the 24th of June, a grandiose affair in which the royal couple walked the streets of London to great aplomb, in the same finery that Henry's father and his first wife Elizabeth of York had worn for their special day a generation earlier. With their new subjects cheering and applauding, they made their way from the Tower of London to Westminster for the ceremony, a procession in which Margaret, wearing a black bonnet and a dress made out of velvet, satin and silk, watched from the comfort of a private residence in Cheapside she had bought specially for the occasion. At Westminster Abbey she opted to be similarly low-key, tucking herself away in a private viewing chamber while she observed the coronation service, overseen by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and in the same manner as she had done when she had first heard the news that her son Henry had triumphed over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, she cried for the difficulties that were bound to follow in the wake of such a happy and momentous occasion. Although she made a public appearance at the great feast that followed after, she did not take part in the entertainments afterwards, instead making her peace with God and removing herself to the abbot's house in Westminster Abbey, where she awaited her death. By then, Margaret had been deteriorating for some time, suggesting that it was a bout of food poisoning that finally took her over the edge, for by the 28th of June, on Henry's 18th birthday, Margaret was on her deathbed, having done everything in her power to ensure that Henry was properly prepared for kingship. And the next day, on the 29th of June 1509, according to a witness who was by her side, the bishop said mass before her, and as he lift up the precious host, this worthy lady expired. And so, as she had honoured the blessed sacrament, even so the last thing that ever she saw, as I do think, was God. It was a fitting end for a woman who had spent so much of her time an ardent worshipper of the Christian faith, and as she ascended to heaven, her widower firmly believed that she is now joyful in that celestial court of heaven, where she shall be in eternal felicity forever. Being an extremely wealthy heiress at a young age, Margaret would become embroiled in the political affairs of the realm through no choice of her own, her loyalties to the Lancastrian fold predetermined by the men who early on ran her life and dictated her future. As in her formative years after the death of her father, when, as a 1-year-old baby, she had no independence of her own, Margaret would prove a useful political pawn for Henry VI to auction off to the highest bidder, and with the added attraction of her royal blood, however tainted, he was easily able to find buyers, the first being William de la Pole, who decided to immediately betroth her to his son John de la Pole. As an oblivious 6-year-old girl, Margaret would become the centre of a scandal that rocked the very foundations of the kingdom after accusations that William de la Pole was using his young charge to make his own beeline for the throne. And just as quickly, Margaret's fate would be determined again by powerful men, taking her down a path that would ultimately put her squarely in the Lancastrian camp during the Wars of the Roses, after it was decided she would marry Edmund Tudor. And from this brief and heartbreaking union would emerge the most important person in her life, Henry. And from the moment she first set eyes on him, she vowed she would do everything in her power to safeguard what was owed to him by birthright, his inheritance. With Edmund dying of the plague, Margaret entered into her second marriage with Henry Stafford, who would be an assuring and loving presence as her son Henry, only a few months old, was taken from her and transferred into the custody of his uncle Jasper Tudor to be raised and protected in Pembroke Castle, Wales. But although Margaret found it easy enough to settle into a peaceful existence in the Surrey countryside, she constantly thought about her son, keeping in regular communication with him and receiving frequent updates about how he was faring. But with the ousting of King Henry VI in 1461 by Edward IV, Margaret was suddenly struck with fear for her son's safety as the Yorkist clan consolidated their rule of the kingdom. Yet, luckily for her, the new monarch proved magnanimous, and with Jasper Tudor following his half-brother, the king, into exile, Henry's guardianship was allocated instead to Lord William Herbert, where he was treated with love and respect. But with her son still separated from her, Margaret embarked on a new strategy throughout the 1460s, one that involved proving her loyalties to the Yorkists with the aim of preserving Henry's inheritance. By 1470, after Henry was briefly reinstated as king, the future looked bright for Margaret, who was reunited with her cherished son and was able to spend a blissful 2 weeks with the teenager at her Woking manor. Yet Margaret would be left inconsolable once again after Edward IV returned to the throne and Henry was forced to flee into exile with his uncle Jasper, and throughout the 1470s and early 1480s, a devastating period where smuggled letters were to be her only form of communication with Henry, she knew she would have to win back Edward's good graces all over again if she were ever to see her son granted safe passage back to his homeland. By 1482, with the help of time and calculated political gestures, Margaret had improved her position in the royal fold to such a degree that Edward was willing to allow Henry to return and for him to be legally endowed with property. But Margaret's plans were to be totally ruined with the usurpation of the crown by Richard III, and following the murders of Edward's successors at the Tower of London, Margaret sprung into action determined to place her own son on the throne, and employing her signature political astuteness, arranged the marriage of Elizabeth of York with Henry to further legitimize his claim by joining the houses of York and Lancaster. But with Margaret's first scheme to destroy Richard's regime going terribly wrong, her life only spared by her marriage to her third husband Stanley, whose support the increasingly loathed Richard needed to guarantee his own political survival, Margaret remained undeterred by the house arrest and the confiscation of all her properties that followed, still keeping secretly in touch with Henry, whose defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth finally liberated her from her shackles and reunited her with her son after 15 long and arduous years, and with Henry crowned the King of England, she finally became the arbiter of her own destiny. As the king's mother, Margaret became the most powerful woman in the realm, and with her inheritance and income now assuredly protected by her femme sole status, she began shaping England in her own image, enriching and entrenching the Tudor family into the very fabric of society via her hawkish accumulation of landed estates, setting up her own judicial system in the East Midlands at Northampton, where her sound and respected judgment saw her regularly intervene in normal as well as ecclesiastical courts, using her vast resources to fund the translation of monumental literary works, nursing the intellectual heritage of the realm by heavily investing in Cambridge University, all the while moulding herself into a paragon of faith and making sure to give generous offerings to religious institutions and to diligently follow the rituals and rites of Christianity for her own salvation. A faith that would indeed be tested by the premature deaths of many of her grandchildren, most notably Prince Arthur, but most significantly by the passing of her own son Henry, whose death affected her so immensely that she was barely able to hold on to her own life for much longer thereafter. But, as always, driven by a sense of familial duty, she made it her mission to survive until she was assured of the continuity of the Tudor dynasty, and, after it was confirmed by the coronation of her grandson King Henry VIII, her life's work was seemingly completed, and Margaret, retiring to the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, passed away a mere 2 weeks later, doubtlessly eager to reunite with Henry, for she could not live without him. What do you think of Margaret Beaufort? Do you think she was single-handedly responsible for Henry VII's succession to the throne? And do you think she was a consistently effective political manipulator? Or that her passion for the welfare of her son made her prone to misjudgments? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.